There will be a moment, sometimes weeks after you've walked away, sometimes months, when the narcissist finally makes their move. And I mean their real move, the one they've been building toward this entire time, convinced it's going to work, convinced they finally understand exactly what went wrong and exactly how to fix it. And here's what makes this moment so genuinely fascinating to watch unfold, if you can watch it from a place of clarity instead of vulnerability. That move, the one they're so confident about, is almost always exactly the wrong one. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, structurally wrong, in a way that reveals something crucial about how little they actually understood about what they lost in the first place. Today, we're breaking down exactly what that mistake is, why they make it almost every single time, and why understanding it might be one of the most protective pieces of insight you carry into whatever happens next. Here's what almost nobody explains clearly about narcissists after they lose someone, and I want you to really sit with this, because it reframes the entire situation in a way that changes how you interpret everything that comes after. When a narcissist loses someone, especially someone who gave them real loyalty, real patience, real emotional investment, their instinct is never to examine what they actually did wrong. That would require a level of internal reckoning their psychological structure simply isn't built to sustain. Instead, their instinct is to examine what strategy failed, treating the entire loss like a tactical error rather than a genuine consequence of how they treated another human being. And this distinction, strategy versus substance, is exactly where the biggest mistake begins to take shape, because everything they do next gets built on that flawed foundation. So let's walk through this carefully, because the mistake itself unfolds in a very specific, very predictable sequence. And once you understand each stage, you'll recognize it instantly if you ever see it happening in your own life, or if you're watching it happen right now. The first thing that happens, almost immediately after the loss registers as real rather than temporary, is what I'd call the audit of tactics. This is where the narcissist mentally reviews everything that happened, not through the lens of what did I do that hurt this person, but through the lens of what approach didn't produce the result I wanted. They think back through the relationship like reviewing game footage, identifying moments where you pushed back, where you set a boundary, where you finally stopped absorbing whatever was happening, and instead of recognizing those moments as evidence of your growing self-respect, they file them away as data points about which specific tactics stopped working. This audit is happening entirely from a place of self-interest, entirely focused on regaining what was lost, with almost no genuine curiosity about your actual experience, your actual pain, your actual reasons for finally walking away. The second thing that happens, once that audit is more or less complete, is the construction of what I'd call the corrective narrative, a story they build, primarily for themselves, but often for anyone else who will listen, that explains the loss in a way that requires the least possible change on their part. This narrative almost never sounds like, I was cruel, and I finally drove away someone who deserved better. It sounds like something much smaller, much more manageable, much easier for their identity to absorb without threatening its foundation. Maybe the narrative becomes, I just wasn't ready to be vulnerable yet, but I am now. Maybe it becomes, I didn't realize how much you needed from me, and now I do. Maybe it becomes something that subtly shifts blame back toward you, something like, we just had different communication styles, or I think we both made mistakes. Notice what all of these versions have in common. They're specific enough to sound like insight, vague enough to require no real accountability, and conveniently framed in a way that positions the narcissist as someone who's grown just enough to deserve another chance, without ever actually requiring the kind of deep, uncomfortable, sustained self-examination that real growth would demand. And this is exactly where the biggest mistake starts to reveal itself, because armed with this audit of tactics and this convenient corrective narrative, the narcissist makes a move that feels, to them, like genuine progress, like real effort, like exactly what should finally win you back. And it is, without exception, some version of trying harder at the same fundamental approach, rather than actually becoming a different kind of person. This is the mistake. Not a lack of effort, not a lack of intensity, not even necessarily a lack of genuine desire to have you back in their life. The mistake is a complete misunderstanding of what actually needs to change, because they're operating from the belief that losing you was a performance problem, something solvable through better execution of the same fundamental strategy rather than a structural problem, something that can only be solved through an entirely different way of relating to another human being altogether. This is why you see such a specific, almost formulaic set of behaviors show up after a narcissist loses someone who's genuinely moved on. You see grander gestures, more elaborate declarations, more intense displays of what looks like devotion, all of it essentially an amplified version of the exact same relational pattern that led to the loss in the first place. If charm didn't work at a normal volume before, they turn up the volume rather than questioning whether charm alone was ever the right currency to be offering. If promises weren't believed the first several times, they make bigger, more specific, more elaborately detailed promises, rather than recognizing that the problem was never the size or specificity of the promise, but the complete absence of follow-through behind every promise that came before it. This is the trap they fall into almost universally, mistaking intensity for substance, mistaking bigger gestures for genuine change, mistaking a louder version of the same broken approach for something fundamentally different. Let's get specific about what this actually looks like in practice, because recognizing these patterns in real time is one of the most protective things you can do for yourself if you're ever on the receiving end of this exact mistake playing out. The first version of this mistake is what I'd call escalated love bombing, a return of all the most intense, most flattering, most overwhelming behaviors from the earliest days of the relationship, deployed now with even greater urgency, precisely because the stakes feel higher, and the previous version of this tactic, while it worked initially, eventually stopped being enough to keep you fully compliant. This might look like an overwhelming series of messages, each one more emotionally intense than the last. It might look like grand, public gestures designed less for your genuine benefit and more for maximum visible impact, something that photographs well, something that generates a reaction from anyone watching. It might look like sudden, dramatic promises about the future, entire life plans constructed and presented within days of reaching back out, as though the sheer scale of the vision alone should be enough to override any doubt you might still be holding on to. The second version of this mistake is what I'd call performative vulnerability, a display of apparent emotional openness, tears, admissions, seemingly raw confessions about their own flaws or struggles, that looks, on the surface, exactly like the genuine accountability you've been hoping to see this entire time. And I want to be really careful here because this is one of the most convincing versions of the mistake, precisely because it mimics real growth so closely that even people who understand narcissistic patterns intellectually can find themselves genuinely moved by it. But here's the crucial distinction that separates performative vulnerability from the real thing. Genuine accountability doesn't just acknowledge that harm happened, it demonstrates a specific, detailed understanding of exactly how that harm happened, exactly what needs to be different, and exactly why previous efforts weren't enough, followed by sustained behavioral change over real time, not just words offered in an emotionally charged moment when the stakes of losing you permanently have finally become real. Performative vulnerability skips straight to the emotional payoff, tears, apparent rawness, the appearance of genuine self-reflection, without ever doing the harder, less visible, less immediately rewarding work that real change actually requires. The third version of this mistake, and this is where things get particularly insidious, is what I'd call strategic third-party mobilization, where instead of approaching you directly, the narcissist works through mutual friends, family members, sometimes even your own support system, to make the case for reconciliation on their behalf. This might look like a mutual friend suddenly, unprompted, bringing up how much the narcissist has really changed, how they've never seen them like this before, how they think you should at least hear them out. This tactic is particularly effective and particularly damaging because it doesn't feel like manipulation coming directly from the narcissist. It feels like independent perspective, like outside validation, precisely because that's exactly what it's designed to feel like, even though, underneath the surface, It's simply another version of the same fundamental mistake, an attempt to win you back through better tactics rather than genuine demonstrated change. And here's exactly where we need to go deeper, because understanding why this mistake happens so consistently, why narcissists so reliably choose amplified performance over genuine internal change, even when genuine change would actually give them a real chance at reconciliation, reveals something crucial about the fundamental limits of their psychological structure. Something that explains not just this specific mistake, but the entire pattern of how narcissists relate to loss, accountability, and change throughout their entire lives. That's exactly where we're going next. That deeper reason, the reason narcissists so consistently choose amplified performance over genuine internal change, comes down to something we've touched on before, but that deserves to be named directly here, because it's the key that finally explains this entire pattern. Genuine change requires sustained access to something a narcissistic psychological structure fundamentally cannot tolerate for long. Prolonged, unflattering self-scrutiny, held steadily, without immediately converting the discomfort into either defensiveness or performance. And this isn't a matter of willpower or motivation. It's a structural limitation, the same one we've discussed in other conversations, rooted in a sense of self that was never built on stable internal ground, but rather constructed entirely out of external reflection and validation. Here's what this actually means in practice. When a narcissist sits with the reality of what they lost, the actual moment of confronting, I hurt someone who loved me, and I did it repeatedly, and I need to fundamentally change who I am in order to deserve a different outcome, that confrontation doesn't produce the kind of humbling, motivating discomfort it would produce in someone with a more secure sense of self. Instead, it produces something closer to genuine psychological threat, because acknowledging that level of flaw threatens the very foundation their entire sense of self is built upon. And when a foundation feels threatened, the system doesn't lean into the discomfort long enough to actually grow from it. It searches, almost reflexively, for the fastest possible route back to safety, back to a version of the story where they're still fundamentally acceptable, still fundamentally worthy, still fundamentally in control. Amplified performance, the escalated love bombing, the performative vulnerability, the strategic third-party mobilization, all of it offers exactly that fast route back to safety, because it lets the narcissist feel like they're doing something enormous, something that proves their devotion, without ever requiring the slower, less immediately gratifying, far more threatening work of actually sitting with their own capacity for harm long enough to genuinely restructure how they relate to another person. Genuine change is slow, unglamorous, and offers no immediate emotional payoff. It looks like months of consistent, unremarkable behavior, boundaries respected without complaint, honesty offered even when it's inconvenient, patience extended even when there's no audience to witness it, and reward it with visible appreciation. None of that satisfies the urgent, threatened part of a narcissist's psychology that needs to resolve the discomfort of loss as quickly and dramatically as possible. So they reach, almost every single time, for the version of fixing this that produces the fastest emotional relief for themselves, mistaking that relief for actual repair. This is exactly why the biggest mistake narcissists make after losing someone isn't really about which specific tactic they choose, the love bombing, the performative tears, the third-party campaign. Those are just symptoms. The actual mistake, the one underneath all of them, is a complete misdiagnosis of what was lost in the first place. They believe they lost your attention, your presence, your availability, something that can be won back through sufficiently impressive effort. What they actually lost was your trust, built and then dismantled through hundreds of small moments over time, and trust, unlike attention, cannot be recaptured through intensity. It can only be slowly, patiently rebuilt through consistency, and consistency is precisely the one thing their psychological structure struggles most to sustain, because consistency requires exactly the kind of steady, unglamorous, low-reward behavior that offers none of the immediate validation their system depends on to feel secure. Now, I want to address something important for anyone listening who is currently on the receiving end of this exact mistake unfolding in real time, because recognizing the pattern intellectually and actually holding your ground against it emotionally are two very different challenges. If you're watching a narcissist attempt to win you back through escalated gestures, through tearful confessions, through friends suddenly advocating on their behalf, I want you to understand something clearly. The intensity of their effort is not evidence of the depth of their change. In fact, it's often the opposite. The more dramatic, the more urgent, the more overwhelming the attempt to win you back, the more likely it is that you're witnessing panic dressed up as devotion, rather than genuine transformation. Real change doesn't need to convince you quickly. It doesn't need grand gestures to prove itself because it's not trying to beat a clock. It's not competing against your growing clarity. It's not racing against the possibility that you might move on before it gets the chance to work. Real change simply shows up consistently over time, whether or not you're watching, whether or not there's any guarantee it will be rewarded with your return. I also want to address the specific danger of the third-party mobilization tactic, because I think it deserves special attention given how effective it can be. Precisely because it doesn't feel like it's coming from the narcissist at all. If people close to you, people who love you and generally have your best interests at heart, start advocating on the narcissist's behalf, I want you to hold on to something important. Their perspective, however well-intentioned, is built on incomplete information. They've likely seen a performance of change, a convincing display of remorse or growth, without access to the years of context you carry about how these performances have unfolded before, how convincing they've sounded in the past, how quickly they've evaporated once the immediate crisis of losing you passed. Trust your own accumulated data over anyone else's fresh, limited impression, no matter how sincerely that impression is being offered to you. So what does this all mean for how you interpret whatever happens next, whether you're currently watching this exact mistake unfold or preparing yourself for the possibility that it might someday down the road? I think the most important thing to hold on to is this. Watching a narcissist make this mistake, watching them misdiagnose the loss, watching them reach for intensity instead of consistency, for performance instead of genuine internal work, is not something to feel triumphant or vindictive about, though it's completely understandable if some part of you does feel that way, given everything you've likely been through. It's something to understand clearly, almost clinically, as confirmation of exactly what we've discussed in other conversations, that the structure required for genuine, sustained change was never fully present, and that the version of them capable of finally understanding what they lost, deeply enough to actually become someone different, may simply not exist in the way you've spent so much time hoping it might. And here's where I want to leave you today, because I think it's the most useful, most protective place to land after everything we've walked through. The biggest mistake a narcissist makes after losing you is believing that you are a problem to be solved through better strategy, rather than a person who was genuinely hurt and genuinely deserves something they may simply be structurally incapable of providing. But their mistake doesn't have to become yours. Your job was never to wait around long enough to see if they'd eventually solve the puzzle of winning you back through sufficiently impressive effort. Your job is simply to notice the pattern for what it actually is: intensity without substance, performance without consistency, and to trust that your own clarity, hard-won and genuinely earned through everything you've lived through, matters more than any grand gesture designed to override it. If this helped you recognize a pattern you're currently living through, or gave you language for something you witnessed after you finally walked away, know that you're far from the only one navigating this exact dynamic, and there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed because we go deeper into this every single week.